Sometimes the cruelest thing in this world isn't losing everything you have, it's realizing nobody's coming to help you carry what's left. Eleanor Graves learned that truth the hard way when a ruthless banker threw her and her 3 sons off their land, leaving them with nothing but a rickety wagon and the bitter cold of an early Montana winter. With no money, no family, and nowhere to turn, they faced a fate that seemed all but sealed. Then, through the thickening snow, a lone rider appeared, Jedediah Boone, the quiet mountain man of Bitter Creek. He saw their desperation, understood their pride, and when Eleanor tried to refuse his help, he simply pointed toward his cabin and said, "You're home now." But when the banker sent armed men to take back what he claimed was his, would one man's promise be enough to protect a family that wasn't his by blood? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sometimes the cruelest thing in this world isn't losing everything you have, it's realizing nobody's coming to help you carry what's left. Eleanor Graves learned that truth the hard way when a ruthless banker threw her and her 3 sons off their land, leaving them with nothing but a rickety wagon and the bitter cold of an early Montana winter. With no money, no family, and nowhere to turn, they faced a fate that seemed all but sealed. Then, through the thickening snow, a lone rider appeared, Jedediah Boone, the quiet mountain man of Bitter Creek. He saw their desperation, understood their pride, and when Eleanor tried to refuse his help, he simply pointed toward his cabin and said, "You're home now." But when the banker sent armed men to take back what he claimed was his, would one man's promise be enough to protect a family that wasn't his by blood? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, before the snow and the fear and the desperate journey that would change everything, Eleanor Graves had been hanging laundry in the autumn sunshine while her husband Thomas sang off-key in the barn. It was one of those perfect October mornings in Montana when the air smells like pine and coming winter, and the sky stretches blue enough to make you believe in divine benevolence. She'd been married to Thomas for 23 years, and she still smiled every time she heard him sing, even though he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket with a lid on it, their oldest boy. Samuel was 19 that fall, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, with that same steady way of looking at the world that made folks trust him on sight. He'd been helping Thomas repair the barn roof, handing up shingles and making jokes that carried across the yard. Lucas, 15 and slight, sat on the porch sketching the mountains in the distance, his fingers smudged with charcoal. He was the dreamer of the family, always seeing beauty where others saw just rocks and trees. And young Daniel, just 11, was supposed to be gathering eggs, but was more likely talking to the chickens, giving each hen a different name and personality. Eleanor remembered thinking, as she pinned one of Thomas's work shirts to the line, that this was what contentment felt like. Not happiness exactly. Life was too hard for constant happiness, but the deep satisfaction of knowing where you belonged and who you belonged with. They didn't have much. The homestead was small, the house needed repairs, and some years the harvest barely covered their needs. But it was theirs, paid for with Thomas's sweat and her determination, and they'd built something real here. She'd heard the thump from inside the barn, not loud but wrong somehow, the kind of sound that makes your hands go still and your heart speed up before your mind even understands why. Samuel's shout came next, panicked and young. "Ma, come quick!" Thomas was on the barn floor when she got there, Samuel kneeling beside him, pressing his hands against his father's chest like he could push the life back in. Thomas's face had gone grey, his breath coming in short gasps that sounded like tearing cloth. His eyes found Eleanor's, and in them she saw apology and love and terrible understanding. "Don't you dare," she'd whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. "Thomas Graves, don't you dare leave me." But death doesn't care about dares or prayers or the fact that a woman still needs her husband and 3 boys still need their father. The doctor from town arrived 2 hours later, but by then Thomas was already gone, his heart given out at 52 years old. "Just stop," the doctor said, like a clock that had wound down. Nothing anyone could have done. The pocket watch in Thomas's vest had stopped at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. Eleanor kept it that way, unable to wind it forward, as if keeping that moment frozen might somehow mean it hadn't really happened. The weeks after the funeral passed in a grey blur of casseroles from neighbours and whispered condolences and the terrible task of learning to sleep in a bed that felt too big and too empty. Samuel tried to step into his father's role, working himself near to exhaustion, trying to bring in the last of the harvest. Lucas grew quiet, his sketchbook abandoned. Daniel started having nightmares, calling out for his pa in the dark hours before dawn. Eleanor held them together through sheer will, but the truth was inescapable. They were failing. Without Thomas's strength and knowledge, without his years of experience coaxing crops from stubborn Montana soil, they couldn't make the homestead work. The hay wasn't properly stored. The winter wood wasn't fully cut. The barn repairs sat half-finished, and the first autumn storms found every gap and weakness in their home. Then Cyrus Harland came calling. Eleanor had met him only once before, years ago, when Thomas took out the mortgage to buy their additional acreage. Harland was the kind of man who looked at you like he was calculating your worth down to the penny, thin and sharp-featured, with pale eyes that never seemed to blink. He owned the first bank of Bitter Creek and half the businesses in town besides. Folks said he'd come west after the war with nothing and built an empire through cleverness and an absolute lack of mercy. He arrived in a fine buggy on a cold November morning, dressed in a suit too expensive for a frontier town, looking as out of place in their dusty yard as a peacock in a chicken coop. Eleanor met him on the porch, wiping flour from her hands, her spine straight despite the dread pooling in her stomach. "Mrs. Graves," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've come regarding your outstanding mortgage payment." "I know it's late, Mr. Harland," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. "But we've had, well, you know what we've had. I need a bit more time. Come spring, we'll catch up. Samuel's a good worker, and spring." Harland smiled, and there was no warmth in it whatsoever. "Mrs. Graves, your husband missed the October payment. You're now in default on your loan agreement. The bank is exercising its right to foreclose." The word hit her like a fist to the chest. "Foreclose. Mr. Harland, please, this is our home. My boys have until December 1st to vacate the premises," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but business is business. I have investors to answer to, and I can't make exceptions, no matter how tragic the circumstances." He handed her an envelope, the legal papers inside already prepared, and climbed back into his buggy. Eleanor stood on that porch watching him drive away, and felt the first real terror of what their future might hold. Homeless in winter with 3 boys to feed and nowhere to turn, she tried everything. She went to the other homesteaders, but they were all struggling themselves, barely making ends meet. She went to the church, but Reverend Morrison could offer only prayers and the suggestion that perhaps she might find work as a housekeeper in town. She even swallowed her pride and went back to Harland's office, offering to work off the debt somehow. But his secretary wouldn't even let her pass the lobby. The sympathetic looks from townspeople were almost worse than outright rejection. They pitied her, these good folks who'd known Thomas and liked him, but pity doesn't pay mortgages or put food on the table. One widow with 3 half-grown boys and no money, what could anyone do? On the morning of December 1st, Eleanor and her sons loaded everything they owned into their wagon. It wasn't much, some clothes, a few pots and pans, the quilts Eleanor's mother had made, Thomas's tools, and that stopped pocket watch she couldn't bear to leave behind. Samuel drove, his jaw set tight with anger he couldn't express. Lucas sat in back with Daniel, an arm around his youngest brother, both of them silent. Eleanor looked back once at the house they'd built, at the land they'd worked, at the barn where Thomas had died. Then she turned forward and didn't look back again. Looking back wouldn't help. They had to find a way forward now, even if she had no idea where that forward led. The temperature had been dropping all morning, and by afternoon the first snowflakes began to fall. Early for snow, even in Montana, but this was shaping up to be a hard winter. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and tried not to think about where they'd sleep that night, or the night after, or all the nights stretching ahead into an uncertain future. Samuel turned the wagon north, away from town, into the higher elevations where land was cheaper and settlements were sparse. Maybe they could find an abandoned cabin, he suggested, somewhere to wait out the winter at least. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice, and fingered the simple gold wedding band on her left hand, the one thing of value she'd refused to sell, even when Harland's secretary had suggested it might help with the debt. It was all she had left of Thomas, besides her boys and her memories. She'd rather starve than part with it. The snow fell harder as they climbed, and the temperature continued its steady drop. By nightfall, they were high in the mountain passes, far from any settlement, and Eleanor knew with cold certainty that they couldn't survive long out here. Not in this weather, not without proper shelter or supplies. But they had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. And the wagon kept rolling forward through the gathering dark, because there was nothing else to do but keep moving. Keep trying, keep hoping that somehow, somewhere, salvation might appear. Sometimes the cruelest thing in this world isn't losing everything you have. It's realizing, as snow falls and darkness comes, and your children look to you for answers you don't possess, that you're truly and completely alone. Eleanor didn't know it yet. But help was already watching from the tree line ahead. Help that came in the form of a solitary man who understood exactly what it meant to lose everything, and who still remembered what it felt like to be offered a second chance at belonging. They made camp that first night in a shallow ravine that offered some protection from the wind. Samuel unhitched the horses while Eleanor gathered what dry wood she could find beneath the snow. Lucas started a fire with shaking hands, and Daniel huddled close to the flames, his lips already taking on a bluish tint. Eleanor distributed what food they had, cold biscuits and dried meat, nothing that needed cooking, and tried not to calculate how few days their supplies would last. Samuel ate mechanically, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. Lucas barely touched his portion, and Daniel fell asleep with half a biscuit still clutched in his small fist. "Ma," Samuel said quietly, once the younger boys were settled. "We can't keep going like this. Daniel's already showing signs of cold sickness, and the horses won't last more than a few days in this weather without proper shelter." Eleanor knew he was right. She'd known it since they left, but admitting it out loud felt like surrender. "What choice do we have? We could go back to town. Maybe someone—" "No!" The word came out sharper than she intended. "We tried town, Samuel. There's nothing for us there except pity and closed doors." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Then we keep going north. Maybe we'll find an old trapper's cabin or something. People used to live up here back before the towns got established. It was a slim hope, but it was hope nonetheless." Eleanor nodded and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The temperature was still dropping, and the wind carried a bite that went straight through to the bone. She wondered if Thomas was watching from wherever the dead go, and if he was, what he thought of her leading their boys into the wilderness with no clear plan and winter closing in. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to Daniel's coughing, harsh, rattling sounds that made her heart clench. She felt his forehead in the dim light of their dying fire and found it burning hot. Fever on top of everything else. Samuel was already awake, adding more wood to the fire. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "We need to get him somewhere warm soon." They broke camp at first light, though calling it light was generous. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the snow fell steadily, already covering the tracks they'd made the night before. Daniel lay in the back of the wagon, wrapped in every quilt they had, shivering despite the fever. Lucas sat beside him, one hand on his brother's shoulder, his face pale with worry. The trail, such as it was, grew rougher as they climbed. Twice they had to stop to clear fallen branches, and once the wagon wheel hit a hidden rock hard enough that Eleanor heard something crack. Samuel inspected the damage and shook his head. The wheel split. "It'll hold for now, but not for long. We need to find shelter today, Ma. Not tomorrow. Today." As if in answer, the wheel gave an ominous creak as they started moving again. Eleanor closed her eyes and said a prayer to a god who seemed to have stopped listening weeks ago. When she opened them, she saw a figure on horseback watching them from a ridge, perhaps 50 yards distant. The man sat perfectly still, almost part of the landscape, dressed in furs and leather that blended with the snowy pines. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, with a rifle resting across his saddle. For a moment she thought he might be a threat. There were desperate men in these mountains, men who might see a lone woman and 3 boys as easy prey. But he didn't move toward them. He just watched, and something in his stillness made Eleanor think he was assessing them the way a doctor might assess a patient, cataloguing their condition, determining their chances. Samuel saw him too, and reached for the old pistol Thomas had kept for wolves. "Wait," Eleanor said, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was desperation. Or maybe it was something in the way the stranger sat his horse, not threatening, just observing. "Just wait." The man turned his horse and disappeared back into the trees. Samuel relaxed slightly, but kept the pistol in his lap. They continued on, the wagon wheel protesting with every revolution, Daniel's coughs punctuating the creak of wood and jingle of harness. An hour later, the wheel gave up entirely. The crack became a split, and the split became a break, and suddenly they were listing sideways, the wagon tilting at an angle that made the horses snort nervously. Samuel climbed down to inspect the damage and came back shaking his head. "It's done. Ma, we're not going anywhere on this wheel." Eleanor looked around at the wilderness surrounding them, nothing but snow and trees, and the absolute certainty that they were going to die out here. Daniel's fever was worse. Lucas was shivering despite being wrapped in a blanket. Samuel was trying to be strong, but she could see the fear in his eyes. This was it then, the end of their story. A widow and her 3 boys, frozen in the Montana mountains, because a banker wanted his money, and the world was too hard and too cold to care. Then she heard hoofbeats. The stranger emerged from the trees, riding a sturdy mountain horse, leading a pack mule behind him. Up close, Eleanor could see he was older than she'd first thought, maybe 50, with grey threading through dark hair and beard. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined with the kind of character that came from living a hard life outdoors. But his eyes, when they met hers, were unexpectedly kind. He dismounted without a word and examined their broken wheel with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd seen every kind of frontier problem. Then he looked at the family, really looked, taking in Daniel's flushed face and labored breathing, Lucas's shivering, Samuel's exhausted defiance, and Eleanor's barely controlled desperation. "You've got a sick child," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like he didn't speak often. "How long?" "Since last night," Eleanor said, straightening her spine despite everything. "We're managing." He gave her a look that suggested he knew exactly how well they were managing. "That wheel won't be fixed out here. Not properly. And your boy needs to be somewhere warm." He paused, seeming to weigh something internal. "My cabin's about 2 miles northeast. Got a good stove, proper beds, medicine that might help with fever." Pride, that terrible stubborn pride that had kept Eleanor going through Thomas's death and Harland's cruelty, rose up in her throat. "We don't need charity, mister. We'll manage somehow." "Ma," Samuel said quietly. "Daniel, I know what Daniel needs," she snapped, then immediately felt ashamed. These were exactly the kind of closed doors and impossible pride she'd encountered in town. And here was someone offering genuine help, and she was about to refuse it because accepting meant admitting they'd failed. The stranger was watching her with those kind, patient eyes. "Name's Jedediah Boone. Folks call me Jed. I live alone, got more space than I need. Your boy's sick, your wagon's broken, and it's going to snow heavy tonight." He gestured toward the darkening sky. "I'm not offering charity, ma'am. I'm offering common sense. You can sort out pride and payment later, after your family's safe and warm. Something in his voice, the calm reasonableness of it, the lack of pity or judgment, broke through Eleanor's defenses. She looked at Daniel, heard his ragged breathing, and made the only choice a mother could make. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "Jed," he corrected. He was already moving, pulling tools from his pack mule. "Let's get this wheel patched enough to make it to the cabin. Won't hold long, but it doesn't need to." He worked quickly and competently, barely speaking except to direct Samuel in helping. Eleanor watched this strange mountain man repair their wagon with practiced hands, and wondered what kind of life had led him to live alone in this wilderness, and what had made him stop to help a desperate family when he could have just ridden past. Within half an hour, he'd rigged a temporary fix, leather straps and wooden splints that wouldn't last more than a few miles, but didn't need to. "Follow me," he said, mounting his horse. "Stay in my tracks. Trail gets tricky ahead." They followed him through the gathering dusk as the snow fell harder. True to his word, the trail was treacherous. Narrow paths along ridgelines, steep descents that made Eleanor's heart climb into her throat. But Jed knew every turn, every safe passage, leading them steadily through terrain that would have killed them if they'd tried it alone. Just as full darkness settled, they rounded a bend and saw it, a cabin nestled in a small valley, smoke rising from its chimney, warm light glowing from its windows. It looked like something from a dream, a haven impossible and perfect. Jed rode up to the door and dismounted. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop, and for a moment nobody moved. It felt too good to be true. This salvation appearing exactly when they needed it most. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, and her legs nearly gave out. She steadied herself against the wheel and looked at this stranger who'd saved them without even knowing their names. "Mr. Boone, Jed, we can't possibly impose on your hospitality. If we could just stay one night until Daniel's fever breaks." He shook his head, and something in his expression made him look years older, touched by old grief. "You're not imposing, and you're not leaving in a day or two." He gestured toward the cabin, and his voice was firm but gentle. "You're home now." Those 3 words hung in the cold air, simple and profound. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. Samuel helped Lucas get Daniel out of the wagon, and the boy stirred enough to look around with glassy, confused eyes. Jed held the cabin door open, and warmth spilled out into the night. Inside, Eleanor could see a large stone fireplace with a proper fire burning, a sturdy table, chairs, and most importantly, beds built into the wall. Real beds with what looked like actual mattresses. "There's a room for you and the young one," Jed said, nodding toward Daniel, "and space for the older boys near the fire. I'll bed down in the loft. Get your family inside and warm. We'll worry about everything else tomorrow." Eleanor wanted to argue, to maintain some shred of independence and dignity. But Daniel coughed again, a sound that rattled in his small chest, and Samuel was looking at her with eyes that begged her to let this happen. So she nodded, and they carried their few belongings inside. And for the first time since Thomas died, Eleanor Graves felt something other than grinding fear and exhaustion. She felt, against all reason and expectation, the faint stirring of hope. Jed busied himself getting a kettle of water heating, pulling down dried herbs from bundles hanging from the rafters. "Willow bark and elderberry," he explained, measuring portions with practiced ease. "Good for fever. Get him to drink a cup when it steeps." Eleanor settled Daniel into the bed, a real bed, with clean blankets that smelled like cedar and wood smoke. His fever was high, but the warmth of the cabin was already helping. She pulled the quilts up around his chin and smoothed his damp hair back from his forehead. "You're going to be all right," she whispered. "We all are." For the first time in months, she almost believed it. The first week in Jedediah Boone's cabin passed in a strange mixture of discomfort and relief. Daniel's fever broke on the 3rd day, thanks to Jed's herbal remedies and the warmth of a proper shelter. The boy was weak but recovering. spending his days wrapped in blankets near the fire, asking Jed endless questions in that uninhibited way children have. Eleanor threw herself into making herself useful, because sitting idle while accepting charity felt like swallowing glass. She cooked meals with the supplies Jed had stored, venison and root vegetables, dried beans and cornmeal. She mended his shirts and patched his worn trousers, discovering holes that had gone unrepaired for what must have been years. She swept the cabin floors and organized his shelves and did everything she could think of to earn their keep. Jed watched her industry with what might have been amusement, though his weathered face didn't give much away. He didn't tell her to stop, didn't insist she rest. He seemed to understand that Eleanor needed to contribute, that accepting help without reciprocation would break something fundamental in her. The cabin itself was larger than it had appeared from outside. One main room with the fireplace and kitchen area, a smaller bedroom that Jed insisted Eleanor and Daniel take, and a loft above where Jed had moved his own bedroll so Samuel and Lucas could sleep near the warmth of the fire. It was well built and well maintained, the kind of place that spoke of a man who knew how to take care of himself and his property. But there were odd, empty spaces too. A rocking chair that sat unused in the corner, its wood still smooth and unweathered as if it had never been sat in. Shelves built at a lower height than seemed practical for a man of Jed's size. And most noticeably, a cradle near the bedroom door, beautifully crafted from pine, gathering dust. Eleanor noticed these things, but didn't comment. Everyone had their private sorrows, and Jed's were clearly carved into the very structure of his home. Samuel had taken to following Jed around like a shadow, eager to learn and to prove his worth. On the fourth morning, Jed handed him an axe and led him out to the woodpile. "Your grip's wrong," Jed said, watching Samuel's first few swings. "You're using your arms too much. Power comes from your core and your legs. Like this," he demonstrated, and the axe came down with a clean, efficient stroke that split the log perfectly. Samuel tried again, adjusting his stance, and this time the log split cleanly. A smile broke across his face, the first real smile Eleanor had seen from him since Thomas died. "That's it," Jed said with a small nod. "You'll build up the strength with practice. Your pa teach you much about woodcraft?" Samuel's smile faded slightly. "Some. He was going to teach me more, but then—" He stopped, jaw tightening. Jed was quiet for a moment, then said, "Loss is hard, especially losing a father when you're just becoming a man yourself. You feel like you should have learned more, should have been ready." "Yes, sir," Samuel said quietly. "Well," Jed selected another log. "Can't change what's past. But I can teach you what your pa would have taught you if you're willing to learn." Samuel looked at him with something like gratitude, and Eleanor, watching from the cabin window, felt her throat tighten. This strange mountain man was giving her son something she couldn't, a way forward, a path to becoming the man Thomas would have wanted him to be. Lucas was harder to read. He helped with chores when asked, but remained mostly silent, spending long stretches staring out the window at the mountain landscape. One evening, Eleanor found him at the table with a piece of charcoal from the fire, sketching on the back of an old wanted poster Jed had used to line a shelf. "May I see?" she asked gently. Lucas hesitated, then slid the paper toward her. The sketch showed the view from the window, mountains rising in layers, pine trees heavy with snow, and in the foreground, Daniel and Jed sitting by the fire, Jed whittling something while Daniel watched with rapt attention. It was beautifully done, capturing not just the scene, but the feeling of it, the warmth and quiet companionship. "Lucas, this is wonderful," Eleanor said, and she meant it. "I didn't realize you'd kept drawing." "I stopped for a while," he admitted. "After Pa died, it seemed, I don't know. Silly, I guess. Drawing pictures when everything was falling apart." "It's not silly." Eleanor sat beside him. "Your father loved your drawings. He always said you had a gift for seeing the world differently than other folks." "I miss him, Ma," Lucas said, his voice cracking slightly. "I miss him so much, it feels like I can't breathe sometimes." Eleanor pulled him close, this sensitive middle son of hers who felt everything so deeply. "I know, sweetheart. I miss him too." Jed appeared in the doorway, stopping when he saw them. He started to retreat, but Eleanor shook her head slightly. He set down the firewood he'd been carrying, and after a moment's hesitation, moved closer to look at Lucas's drawing. He studied it for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful. "You've got a real talent, son. These mountains, you captured them just right. The way the light hits the snow, the shadows in the valleys." He paused. "If you want more charcoal for drawing, there's always plenty in the fire. And I've got some old paper stored away that's no use to me." "You're welcome to it." Lucas looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Really." Jed's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Better the paper gets used for something beautiful than sitting in a trunk collecting dust." After Jed went back outside, Lucas looked at his mother with something like wonder. "He didn't say it was a waste of time." "No," Eleanor agreed. "He didn't." That evening, Jed brought down a small trunk from the loft and pulled out several sheets of good paper, yellowed slightly with age but still serviceable. He set them on the table without ceremony, then returned to maintaining his rifle, a beautiful Sharps that he cleaned with meticulous care every evening. Eleanor had noticed the rifle from the first day. It was never far from Jed's reach, always loaded and ready. She wondered what a man living alone in the mountains had to fear, or if it was simply habit from years of self-reliance. Daniel, recovered now and bouncing with restless energy, had attached himself to Jed with the unshakable devotion only an 11-year-old could manage. He followed the man everywhere, chattering constantly, asking about everything from how to track deer to why the sky was blue. Jed bore this attention with patient stoicism, answering questions in his brief way and occasionally showing Daniel some skill or trick of mountain living. Eleanor half expected him to send the boy away, to declare he'd had enough of childish questions. But he never did. One afternoon, she found them outside, Jed teaching Daniel how to identify animal tracks in the snow. See how the elk tracks are split, like two half-moons. And they're bigger than deer tracks, more spread out. Jed pointed to another set of prints. "Now these here—" "Wolf!" Daniel exclaimed. "Good eye. And you can tell they're fresh because the edges are still sharp. If they were old, the sun would have melted them and made them fuzzy." Jed nodded, and Eleanor could swear she saw approval in his eyes. "That's right. You're learning fast. Do you think I could learn to hunt?" Daniel asked eagerly. "Like you and Samuel?" "Maybe," Jed said carefully. "When you're a bit older. Hunting's serious business. Takes patience and respect for the animal." "I can be patient," Daniel insisted, then immediately contradicted himself by bouncing on his toes. "When can we start?" "Tomorrow." This time Jed definitely smiled, a quick flash that transformed his weathered face. "Tell you what, you master tracking first, and we'll talk about the rest." Eleanor turned away from the window, her heart full of complicated feelings. Gratitude for Jed's kindness to her boys. Guilt that they were imposing on his solitude. Fear about what would happen when winter ended and they had to leave. And underneath it all, something she didn't want to examine too closely, a growing awareness of Jedediah Boone as more than just their benefactor. He was. She was starting to realize a good man who'd been alone too long. A man marked by loss, same as she was, trying to make his way in a hard world with whatever grace he could manage. That evening, after the boys were settled in their beds, Eleanor was washing dishes when Jed came to stand beside her, drying each plate and cup with careful attention. "You don't have to help," she said. "You've done more than enough." "So have you," he replied. "Haven't eaten this well in years, or worn shirts without holes." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Your boys are good boys. Credit to you and your late husband. Thomas would have liked you," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the admission. "He appreciated men who knew how to work, who didn't waste words." "Tell me about him," Jed said quietly. "If you want to." So she did. She told him about Thomas's terrible singing and his patient way with the boys, about the homestead they'd built and the dreams they'd shared. She told him about the morning Thomas died, and the awful months that followed, and the moment Cyrus Harland had taken everything they'd worked for. Jed listened without interrupting, his hands continuing their steady work with the dishes. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I was married once," he said finally. "Her name was Rebecca. Met her in Denver, married her 2 months later because we both knew it was right." His voice was distant, remembering. "She was small and fierce, laughed like water over stones. We built this cabin together, planned our life." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. "She died giving birth to our daughter," Jed continued. "The baby died too. Both gone in one night, and I couldn't—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I couldn't save either of them. Doctor said sometimes these things happen, but that didn't help. That didn't bring them back." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor said softly. "That was 15 years ago," Jed said. "I kept the cabin, kept living, but I put away most of the things that reminded me too much. The rocking chair Rebecca wanted, the cradle I built for the baby. Couldn't bring myself to get rid of them, but couldn't stand looking at them either." Eleanor understood then why the cabin had those empty spaces, why Jed lived alone despite clearly being capable of community. He'd built walls around his grief, same as she had, and let the years pass in solitary survival. "This past week," Jed said, still not looking at her, "having your family here, it's reminded me what I gave up when I stopped trying. The cabin feels alive again, like it was always meant to be, full of voices and life, and I just forgot that for a while." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. Her hands had stilled in the washwater, and she found herself very aware of Jed standing beside her. This quiet man who'd opened his home and his carefully guarded heart to a desperate family of strangers. "Thank you," she said finally, "for everything, for saving us, for letting us bring life back to your home." He met her eyes then, and something passed between them. Recognition of shared loss, shared survival, shared hope that maybe life wasn't done with them yet. "You're welcome here," Jed said. "Long as you need, long as you want." He paused. "I mean that, Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it in his rough voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and returned to the dishes. But later, lying in bed with Daniel sleeping peacefully beside her, Eleanor twisted the gold wedding band on her finger and wondered what Thomas would think of this strange, new circumstance they'd found themselves in. She liked to imagine he'd approve of Jed, would appreciate the man's quiet competence and kindness to his boys. She also wondered, with a flutter of something that might have been guilt or might have been hope, what it meant that she was starting to feel at home here in this cabin, with this taciturn mountain man who'd said 3 simple words that had changed everything. "You're home now." Maybe, Eleanor thought as sleep finally claimed her. Maybe they were. The 3rd week marked a turning point, though none of them recognized it at first. A traveling merchant named Hoskins arrived at the cabin one afternoon, his pack mule laden with goods and his weather-beaten face split by a wide grin when he saw smoke rising from Jed's chimney. "Well, I'll be," he called out as Jed emerged to greet him. "Jedediah Boone with actual folks living under his roof. Thought I'd never see the day." "Hoskins," Jed acknowledged with a nod. "You're early this year. Mild spell down in the valley," Hoskins said, dismounting stiffly. "Figured I'd make the rounds before the real snow sets in." His eyes moved past Jed to where Eleanor stood in the doorway, Samuel and Lucas visible behind her. "Got yourself a family, Jed?" "They're staying through winter," Jed said, and something in his tone suggested the subject wasn't open for discussion. "What have you got for trade?" Hoskins knew better than to push, but Eleanor could see the curiosity in his eyes as he unpacked his wares. Flour and sugar, coffee and tobacco, needles and thread, and various other necessities for mountain living. Jed traded furs and smoked meat for supplies, and Eleanor added a request for fabric to make new shirts for the boys, who were growing faster than their clothes could keep up. As Hoskins was repacking to leave, he glanced at Jed and lowered his voice, though not low enough that Eleanor couldn't hear from where she stood inside. "Heard something in town you should know about," Hoskins said. "That banker, Harland, he's been asking questions. Specifically about a widow woman and 3 boys. Says she owes him money that he's got a right to collect." Eleanor's blood went cold. She saw Jed's shoulders stiffen. "She doesn't owe him anything," Jed said flatly. "He foreclosed on her property. That debt's settled. That's what I thought too, Hoskins agreed. But Harland's saying different. Claims there were personal loans separate from the mortgage. Says he's got documents proving it. Don't know if it's true or not, but he's got the law in his pocket, and he seems mighty determined to find this woman. Jed was quiet for a long moment. He mentioned my place? Not yet, Hoskins said, but won't take him long to figure out where they might have gone. Not many places a family can survive in these mountains. He paused. Just thought you should know. Harland's not the forgiving type, and he doesn't like being made to look foolish. After Hoskins left, Jed came inside to find Eleanor sitting at the table, her face pale. The boys had gone to tend the horses, giving the adults a moment of privacy. There were no personal loans, Eleanor said, her voice shaking with anger more than fear. Thomas never borrowed from Harland outside the mortgage. This is a lie, another one of his schemes. I believe you, Jed said simply. He sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. Question is, what's he really after? Why chase you all the way into the mountains over money he knows you don't have? Eleanor thought back to the day of the foreclosure, to something Harland had said in passing. He mentioned investors once, said something about development coming to the valley. Maybe our land is worth more than we knew, or he wants to make an example, Jed said grimly. Show everyone in Bitter Creek that Cyrus Harland gets what he's owed, no matter what. Fear's good for business. What do we do? Eleanor asked. Jed reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a brief, warm pressure that steadied her. We prepare. Winter's coming on hard now. He won't send anyone up here until spring at the earliest. That gives us time. Time for what? Time to make sure you and the boys are protected, Jed said. This land is mine, free and clear. Paid off before Harland even arrived in Montana. He's got no claim here, and if he tries to make one, I've got the deed to prove otherwise. But if he comes with the law, then we deal with it when it happens, Jed interrupted gently. Eleanor, I meant what I said. You're home now. That means something to me. That means I protect what's mine. The way he said mine made Eleanor's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She met his eyes and saw determination there. And something else, something that looked like possession, but the good kind. The kind that meant claiming and being claimed in return. I won't let you risk your home for us, she said, even as she knew it was a futile protest. Too late, Jed replied with the ghost of a smile. Already decided. That evening Jed gathered all 4 graves around the table after supper. He spread out a hand-drawn map of his property, and Eleanor recognized the care and detail in it. This was a man who knew every inch of his land. We've got maybe 3 months before the pass is clear enough for anyone to reach us, Jed said. Maybe 4 if the winter's hard. That time needs to be used well. You think he'll really come? Samuel asked. I think Harland's the type who doesn't let things go, Jed replied. So we prepare for the worst and hope for the best. He looked at Samuel directly. That means you boys need to learn to handle yourselves. Not just work, but defense. You mean fighting? Lucas asked, and Eleanor heard the worry in his voice. Her gentle middle son had never been inclined toward violence. I mean, protecting what's yours, Jed corrected. There's a difference between looking for trouble and being ready when trouble finds you. He tapped the map. This land has good defensive positions. The cabin's built with thick logs, windows placed for crossfire. There's a root cellar that can serve as shelter if needed. And the terrain, anyone coming up here has to come through narrow passes where they can be seen from a long way off. Eleanor listened as Jed outlined his thinking, and she realized this wasn't the first time he'd considered how to defend this place. This was a man who'd spent 15 years alone in hostile territory, who'd survived by being prepared and aware. Now he was extending that protection to her family. Tomorrow we start training, Jed continued. Samuel, you've already got the basics with a rifle. We'll build on that. Lucas, I know you're not keen on guns, but you need to know how to handle one regardless. And Daniel, he looked at the youngest Graves, you're going to learn to be our eyes and ears. How to watch, how to spot danger, how to move quiet and quick. Like a scout, Daniel asked eagerly. Exactly like a scout, Jed confirmed. Eleanor wanted to protest, wanted to insist that this was too much, that they should just leave before winter set in completely, before they brought trouble down on Jed's head. But she looked at her sons' faces and saw determination there, and she knew they'd already made their choice. They weren't running anymore. "What about me?" she asked quietly. Jed met her eyes. "You're going to learn to shoot too? And more importantly, you're going to help me document everything. The original deed to this land. The records of your husband's dealings with Harland. Anything that proves he's lying about those supposed loans. If it comes to a legal fight, we need evidence." Over the following days, a new routine emerged. Mornings were still dedicated to the necessary work of survival: hunting, trapping, wood-cutting, cooking, and maintaining the homestead. But afternoons became training time. Jed started with Samuel, teaching him not just to shoot, but to shoot well, how to account for wind and distance, how to track a moving target, how to breathe and steady himself before pulling the trigger. Samuel proved a natural, his father's steady nerves showing through. Lucas was more reluctant, his hands shaking the first time he held the rifle. But Jed was patient, never pushing, always explaining the why behind each lesson. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Lucas said one afternoon, "after missing the target for the 10th time. "Hopefully you won't have to," Jed replied. "But if someone comes here meaning harm to your family, you need to be able to protect them. That's not about wanting violence, son. That's about loving the people who depend on you." Something in those words got through. Lucas's next shot hit the target, and while he'd never have Samuel's natural skill, he became competent enough to be relied upon. Daniel took to his role as scout with enthusiasm that worried Eleanor slightly. Jed taught him to move through the snow without leaving obvious tracks, to watch for signs of approach, to recognize the sound of riders versus wildlife. The boy learned to read weather signs and to understand the mountain's moods. "You've got sharp eyes and a quick mind," Jed told him. "Those are worth more than strength sometimes. A good scout can save lives just by seeing danger before it arrives." Daniel glowed under the praise, and Eleanor watched her youngest son transform from a grieving child into someone with purpose and confidence. As for Eleanor herself, Jed taught her to handle his spare rifle, a lighter weapon than his sharps, easier for her to manage. She'd never fired a gun before, and the first shot nearly knocked her over. But she was stubborn, and she was motivated by a mother's fierce protectiveness. And within a week, she could hit a stationary target more often than not. "You're a natural," Jed told her one afternoon, and she felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. Evenings were spent documenting everything they could remember about Thomas's dealings with Harland. Eleanor wrote out a detailed timeline, while Lucas sketched maps of their old homestead, marking property lines and improvements they'd made. Samuel contributed what he remembered of his father's business discussions, and even Daniel helped by recalling small details that proved surprisingly important. Jed produced his own property deed, a document yellowed with age, but clear and legal, showing that his father had claimed this land in 1855 and that ownership had passed to Jedediah upon his death in 1868. There was no mortgage, no line, no legal claim anyone could make on this property. "This is important," Jed explained, pointing to the detailed property description. "See these survey markers mentioned? They're physical stones placed by the territorial surveyor. If anyone challenges my ownership, those markers prove my borders." "Have you checked them recently?" Eleanor asked. "Not for years," Jed admitted. "Winter makes it hard to get to some of them. They're up in the high country. But come spring, before anyone can make a move, Samuel and I will go verify they're still there and document their locations." As they worked, Eleanor became aware of how seamlessly they'd become a unit. Jed would start a thought and she'd finish it. Samuel would ask a question, and Jed would answer as naturally as if he'd been teaching the boy his whole life. Lucas would sketch something, and Jed would suggest improvements with the eye of someone who genuinely cared about the boy's development. Daniel would chatter on about something he'd learned, and Jed would listen with attention that never wavered. They were becoming a family, and everyone knew it, except maybe they were all too careful to say it out loud. One evening, Eleanor was mending by firelight when she noticed Daniel had fallen asleep against Jed's shoulder. The man had been reading aloud from an old newspaper, and the boy had gradually dozed off, lulled by the deep rumble of Jed's voice. Jed looked down at Daniel, then at Eleanor, and there was such tenderness in his expression that she had to look away before the tears gathering in her eyes could fall. Later, after she'd carried Daniel to bed and tucked him in, she found Jed standing at the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape lit by moonlight. "He called me Pa today," Jed said quietly. Daniel did. "He was asking me something and he said, 'Pa, can you show me?' And then he stopped, looked embarrassed, said he was sorry." "What did you say?" Eleanor asked. "I told him it was all right," Jed replied. "That he could call me whatever felt right to him." He paused. Should I have discouraged it? I don't want to replace his father's memory." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Thomas would want his boys to have someone they could call Pa, and I think—" She stopped, gathering courage. "I think he'd approve of you." Jed turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw hope and fear and longing all mixed together. "Eleanor, we should get some sleep," she said, suddenly afraid of where this conversation might lead, of what they might say that couldn't be unsaid. "Tomorrow's another day of training." She retreated to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her, and sat on the edge of the bed with her heart racing. She touched Thomas's pocket watch, still frozen at 2:47, and whispered, "I still love you. I always will. But I think I might be falling for him too. Is that all right? Can I do both?" The watch, of course, didn't answer. But somehow, sitting in the quiet darkness of a cabin that was starting to feel like home, Eleanor felt at peace with the question. Even without an answer, outside snow continued to fall, and winter settled in with the promise of a long, sheltered season. Inside, a family that had been broken was slowly knitting itself back together in a new configuration, preparing for the challenges ahead while learning to trust in the present moment. And somewhere in the valley below, Cyrus Harland made his plans, unaware that the widow and her sons had found something worth fighting for, and a protector who wouldn't back down. The fourth week brought deeper cold and deeper bonds. The snow piled high enough that the cabin windows on the north side were half buried, creating a hushed, insulated world where time seemed to slow. They were truly snowed in now, cut off from the valley below, until spring came to melt the passes. Eleanor found herself settling into rhythms that felt both strange and right. She woke before dawn to help Jed with the fire, and they'd share that first cup of coffee in companionable silence, watching the darkness gradually lighten to grey through the frost-covered windows. Her hands had learned the geography of his kitchen, knew where he kept the cornmeal and coffee, the salt pork and dried beans. She'd reorganized his shelves without asking, and he'd accepted the changes without comment, as if her mark on his space was natural and welcome. The boys had fully adapted to mountain life. Samuel moved with Jed's economy of motion now, no wasted effort, every action purposeful. He'd taken to wearing the hunting knife Jed had given him at all times, and Eleanor noticed how he'd touch it sometimes, as if reminding himself of his capability and responsibility. Lucas spent his free time sketching, and his portfolio grew daily. He'd captured the cabin from every angle, the mountains in different lights, his brothers at work and rest. But his best drawings were the ones of simple moments, Daniel laughing at something Jed said, Samuel concentrating as he cleaned his rifle, Eleanor kneading bread with flour, dusting her apron. These sketches showed a family, undeniably and completely. One afternoon, Lucas showed Eleanor a drawing he'd been working on in secret. It showed all 5 of them around the dinner table, heads bowed in grace, hands linked. The detail was extraordinary. You could see the grain in the wooden table, the individual stitches in Eleanor's dress, the way the firelight caught in Jed's hair. "It's beautiful." "Lucas," Eleanor said, her voice catching. "I want to give it to Jed," Lucas said, "for Christmas. We don't have money to buy presents, but I thought maybe this—" "Christmas!" Eleanor had been so focused on survival that she'd lost track of the calendar. She did quick calculations and realized it was less than 2 weeks away. "He'll love it," she assured Lucas. "It's perfect." That evening, after the boys were asleep, Eleanor mentioned Christmas to Jed. He looked almost uncomfortable. "Haven't celebrated Christmas in years," he admitted. "Didn't see much point when it was just me." "Well, it's not just you anymore," Eleanor said gently. "And the boys, especially Daniel, they need something to look forward to. Something normal and good." Jed was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "All right. What do folks usually do for Christmas up here?" "Nothing fancy," Eleanor said. "A good meal if we can manage it. Maybe small gifts, though we don't have much to work with." She paused. "Mostly it's about being together, acknowledging that we've made it through another year, that we have each other." "That I can do," Jed said, and something in his voice made Eleanor look at him more closely. He was staring into the fire, his weathered face thoughtful. "Might be nice, actually. Having something to celebrate again." Over the next week, everyone prepared in secret. Eleanor noticed Jed disappearing into the barn for long stretches, heard the sound of sawing and planing. Samuel vanished into the woods for hours at a time, returning with mysterious bundles he wouldn't let anyone examine. Even Daniel was working on something, his small hands busy with what looked like pine cones and bits of string. Eleanor herself was knitting, something she'd started weeks ago but now poured herself into with renewed purpose. She was making a scarf for Jed, using wool yarn she'd unraveled from an old sweater of Thomas's. It felt right somehow, taking something of Thomas's and making it into something for Jed, as if she was weaving her past and present together. The work was meditative, and as her fingers moved through the familiar patterns, Eleanor let herself think about things she'd been avoiding. She thought about the fact that she smiled more now than she had in months, that she looked forward to mornings because they meant coffee with Jed, that she'd started noticing small things about him, the way his eyes crinkled when he almost smiled, how gently he handled even the smallest creatures, the rough kindness in his voice when he spoke to her sons. She thought about the evening a few days ago when she'd been reaching for something on a high shelf, and Jed had come up behind her to help, his hand covering hers on the jar of preserves, his presence solid and warm at her back. They'd stood frozen for a heartbeat too long, and when Eleanor had turned, they'd been close enough that she could see the flecks of green in his grey eyes. "Thank you," she'd whispered, and he'd nodded and stepped back, but something had shifted in that moment. Some invisible boundary acknowledged and carefully not crossed. Eleanor knew what was happening. She was falling in love with Jedediah Boone, this quiet mountain man who'd saved her family and given them not just shelter, but purpose and belonging. The realization didn't come as a shock, so much as a gentle recognition, like watching sunrise and finally being able to name the moment when night became day. But she didn't know what to do about it. Thomas had been dead less than 4 months. Was it too soon? Was she dishonoring his memory by feeling these things for another man? And even if she could reconcile her own feelings, what about Jed? He was kind to her, protective, but that might be simple decency rather than deeper affection. She twisted the gold band on her finger, Thomas's ring that she still wore, still couldn't quite imagine removing. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Eleanor prepared the best meal she could manage, venison roast that Samuel had shot, root vegetables from Jed's stores, biscuits with precious honey, and dried apple pie made from fruit Jed had preserved the previous fall. After dinner, they gathered around the fire, and Jed surprised everyone by producing a small pine tree he'd cut and brought inside, setting it in a bucket of stones near the hearth. "Thought we should have a proper Christmas tree," he said, looking almost embarrassed by the gesture. Daniel's eyes went wide with delight, and even Samuel and Lucas smiled. They decorated it with what they had, strings of popcorn Eleanor and Daniel had made, pine cones painted with soot mixed with water to make them dark and interesting, and strips of cloth torn from worn-out clothes and tied into bows. When they finished, the little tree looked humble but cheerful. A small celebration of life and creativity in the midst of wilderness and winter. "It's perfect," Eleanor said, and she meant it. They sang carols, the boys remembered most of the words, and Jed contributed a surprisingly pleasant bass voice that Eleanor had never heard before. She caught herself watching him as he sang, seeing a different side of this taciturn man, and when he met her eyes across the firelight, something passed between them that made her breath catch. Finally, it was time for gifts. Daniel went first, proudly presenting everyone with small figures he'd carved from pine branches, crude but recognizable animals. A deer for Samuel, a bird for Lucas, a bear for Jed, and for his mother a rabbit. "Because you're quick and smart and you take care of everyone," Daniel explained earnestly. And Eleanor had to hug him to hide the tears in her eyes. Lucas gave his drawing to Jed, who took it with hands that weren't quite steady. He studied it for a long time, his expression unreadable, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "This is, Lucas, this is the finest gift anyone's ever given me," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you." Lucas beamed, and Eleanor saw how much her middle son had needed that validation, that acceptance of his art as something valuable and worthwhile. Samuel presented his mother with a beautifully tanned rabbit pelt, soft as silk, dyed a rich brown with walnut husks. "For a new winter cloak," he said. "I know your old one's worn through." Eleanor held the pelt against her cheek, marveling at the workmanship. "Samuel, this is beautiful. When did you learn to tan leather?" "Jed's been teaching me," Samuel said, glancing at the older man with obvious respect and affection. Jed's gifts were practical but thoughtful. A new whetstone for Samuel. A set of proper drawing pencils he must have ordered from Hoskins months ago for Lucas. And for Daniel, a small knife appropriate for a boy, with a sheath that bore Daniel's initials carved into the leather. For Eleanor, he produced a rocking chair cushion, beautifully made from leather and stuffed with something soft. "Thought you might want to use that chair," he said, nodding toward the unused rocker in the corner. "Seems a shame for it to sit empty." Eleanor understood what he was really saying, that Rebecca's chair didn't need to be a shrine anymore, that it could be used and loved again without dishonoring memory. She stood and kissed his cheek without thinking, a brief press of lips against weathered skin, and felt him go still beneath her touch. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." When she pulled back, she saw something raw and hopeful in his eyes, quickly shuttered, but not before she recognized it for what it was. Finally, Eleanor brought out the scarf she'd knitted, midnight blue with a pattern of mountains running through it. She wrapped it around Jed's neck, her fingers lingering perhaps longer than necessary as she arranged it just so. "To keep you warm," she said softly. "When you're out in the cold." Jed touched the scarf, his fingers tracing the pattern. "It's from Thomas's sweater," he said, not a question but an observation. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. I thought he wouldn't mind, that he'd be glad his things were keeping someone safe." "I'll treasure it," Jed said, and the weight of meaning in those words made Eleanor's heart race. They sat around the fire late into the night, the boys eventually drowsing off one by one. Samuel carried Daniel to bed, and Lucas followed shortly after, leaving Eleanor and Jed alone with the dying fire and the small Christmas tree casting gentle shadows. "This was a good day," Jed said quietly. "Best Christmas I can remember in a long time. Maybe ever. For me too," Eleanor agreed. She was sitting in the rocking chair with its new cushion, and Jed was in his usual spot by the fire, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him. "Eleanor," Jed began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "I need to tell you something, and I don't know quite how to say it right." Eleanor's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "You can tell me anything. When you and the boys came here, I thought I was just helping folks in need," Jed said, still looking at the fire rather than at her, doing what any decent person would do. "But you've become..." He stopped, frustrated with his inability to articulate what he felt. Eleanor waited, barely breathing. "I love your sons like they were my own," Jed finally said. "Samuel's got his father's best qualities, and I'm proud to teach him what I know. Lucas has a gift that shouldn't be wasted, and I want to help him develop it. And Daniel," his voice softened, "Daniel's given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to be patient and playful. A reason to hope, Jed, Eleanor began, but he held up a hand. Let me finish, please. Because if I don't say this now, I might lose my nerve. He finally turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his expression nearly broke her. And I love you, Eleanor. I've tried not to. Tried to tell myself it was too soon, that you were still grieving, that I had no right. But I can't help it. You brought my home back to life. You've reminded me what it means to care about someone, to want to protect and provide and belong to someone again. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't think I could. I thought loving you would mean betraying Thomas's memory. But I don't think that's how love works. I think we have enough love for both the people we've lost and the people we find. And I've found you, Jed, or maybe you found me. Either way, I don't want to lose this. Jed crossed the small distance between them and knelt beside the rocking chair, taking her hands in his. I'm not asking you to forget Thomas or to take off that ring before you're ready. I'm just asking, can there be room for me too? Can we build something here together? Yes, Eleanor said through her tears. Yes, there's room for you. There's room for all of this. He pulled her gently to her feet and into his arms, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest and feeling his heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, and Eleanor felt something in her chest that had been frozen since Thomas died finally begin to thaw. We'll go slow, Jed murmured into her hair. We've got time. No need to rush anything. No need to rush, Eleanor agreed. But she tilted her head up, and when he bent down, their lips met in a kiss that was tender and tentative and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling, real, full smiles that transformed both their faces. Eleanor touched the scarf around Jed's neck, then reached up to cup his weathered cheek. Merry Christmas, Jed. Merry Christmas. Eleanor. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the mountain in pristine white. Inside, two people who'd both lost their first loves had found their way to a second chance at happiness. And upstairs in the loft, three boys slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had a home and a family and a future that looked at last like it might turn out all right. The gold band still circled Eleanor's finger, and Thomas's pocket watch still sat frozen at 2:47. But Eleanor understood now that keeping those things didn't mean staying frozen herself. Love wasn't a finite resource that ran out when you used it. It was something that could expand and grow, making room for old grief and new joy, for memory and hope, for what was lost and what was found. She was home now. They all were. And that was the greatest gift of all. January came with a cold so fierce it made the previous week seem mild. The temperature dropped so low that water thrown from a cup would freeze before hitting the ground. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the constantly burning fire, creating crystalline patterns that Daniel traced with his finger each morning. But inside the cabin, warmth of a different kind had taken root. After Christmas Eve's confessions, Eleanor and Jed moved forward with the careful deliberateness of people who understood the value of what they'd found. There were no grand declarations or dramatic changes, just small adjustments that spoke of deepening commitment. Jed began sitting closer to Eleanor in the evenings, their shoulders touching as they worked on their separate tasks. She'd reach over to refill his coffee without asking, and he'd hand her the thread she needed before she looked for it. Their hands would brush in passing, and they'd share private smiles that made the boys exchange knowing glances. Samuel had been the first to truly understand what was developing between his mother and Jed. One morning, as he and Eleanor prepared breakfast while Jed was outside checking the animals, Samuel said quietly, "Pa would approve, you know." Of Jed, Eleanor's hands stilled over the biscuit dough she was kneading. "You think so?" "I know so," Samuel said firmly. Pa always said the measure of a man was how he treated those weaker than himself. Jed could have turned us away, but he didn't. He could have helped us just enough to get by, but instead he's teaching us, protecting us, caring about our futures. He paused. "And he makes you smile again, Ma, really smile. Pa would want that for you." Eleanor had to turn away to hide her tears. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Samuel replied, and she wasn't entirely sure if he meant Thomas or Jed. Perhaps he meant both. Lucas, in his quieter way, had also given his blessing. He'd started a new drawing, one he worked on in secret but that Eleanor had glimpsed once. It showed her and Jed standing together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking out at the mountains. The drawing was titled New Beginnings, and Eleanor had pretended not to see it. Knowing Lucas would present it when he was ready, Daniel, with a child's straightforward acceptance, had simply started calling Jed Pa without self-consciousness. The first few times, Jed had looked startled, but he'd never corrected the boy, and gradually the name had become natural. Samuel and Lucas still called him Jed, which felt right. They were old enough to remember Thomas clearly, to hold space for both the father they'd lost and the man who was stepping into that role now. But one evening in mid-January, everything nearly fell apart. They were gathered around the table after supper when Samuel suddenly said, "Jed, I've been thinking. Come spring, when the pass is clear, what's going to happen?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor's hands stilled over the mending in her lap. Lucas looked up from his sketching. Even Daniel stopped playing with the wooden animals he'd carved. Jed set down the leather strap he'd been working on. "What do you mean?" "I mean with Harland," Samuel said. "He's not going to forget about us. And if he comes with the law, with papers saying Ma owes money, what then? Can we really stand against that?" It was the question they'd all been carefully not asking, the shadow that lurked beneath their growing happiness. "We have evidence," Eleanor said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "The documents showing Thomas never took those loans, your deed proving this land is yours. But Harland has the law on his side," Lucas interjected quietly. "And he has money, enough to make forgeries look real, enough to bribe judges and hire men with guns. So what are you suggesting?" Jed asked, his voice carefully neutral. "That we run? That we give up before the fight even starts?" "I'm suggesting we face reality," Samuel said, and there was frustration in his voice. "I'm 19 years old, Jed. I'm not a child. And I can see what's happening here. You and Ma, you care about each other, maybe more than care. But what kind of future can you build if Harland can take it all away?" "He can't take what's mine," Jed said firmly. "This land is legally mine, and no banker can change that." "But he can make Ma leave," Samuel persisted. "If he has legal papers, even false ones, he can force her to come back to Bitter Creek to face charges. And what happens to us then? We're right back where we started, only now we've dragged you into our mess." Eleanor saw where this was going, saw the fear and protective instinct driving her oldest son. "Samuel, maybe we should leave," Samuel said, the words tumbling out now. "Before spring. Before Harland can come. We could go further north, into Canada maybe. Start fresh where he can't find us?" "No," Jed said, and the steel in his voice made everyone look at him. "Absolutely not. But I said no." Jed stood, and Eleanor could see tension in every line of his body. "You want to know what happens when Harland comes? I'll tell you. We stand our ground. We show him our evidence. We face down his lies with truth. And if he brings men with guns, then we defend what's ours. And if we lose," Lucas asked quietly, "if the law sides with him despite everything, then we appeal," Jed said. "We go to the territorial governor if we have to. But we don't run and we don't surrender. Because if we do, Harland wins. He gets to keep victimizing people, keep using the law as a weapon, keep taking what isn't his. This isn't your fight," Samuel said, and his voice cracked slightly. "We are grateful for everything you've done, but we can't ask you to risk everything for us." "You're not asking," Jed replied. "I'm choosing, and I've already made my choice." He looked at Eleanor, and the intensity in his gaze made her heart clench. "Your mother and I, we've talked about this. We've talked about a lot of things, and I need you boys to understand something." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, then continued. "I love my wife. Rebecca was everything to me, and when she died, I thought that was it. Thought I'd just live out my days alone, and that would be enough. But it wasn't enough. It was surviving, not living. And then your mother showed up, and you 3 boys, and you reminded me what living actually feels like." Jed moved to stand beside Eleanor's chair. and she reached up to take his hand. "So here's what's going to happen," Jed continued. "When spring comes, we're going to gather every piece of evidence we have. We're going to ride down to Bitter Creek together, all of us, and we're going to face Harland with the truth. If he's made forgeries, we'll prove they're false. If he's bribed the local law, we'll go over their heads. And if he brings violence, we'll defend ourselves." "But what if—" Lucas started. "No," Eleanor interrupted, standing to face her sons. "Jed's right. We've been running and hiding and trying to stay small and invisible. But that's not how we survive. That's how we disappear. Your father didn't raise you to be afraid, and I haven't kept you safe all these months just to teach you that might makes right and lies win." She looked at each of her boys in turn. "Samuel, you're brave and strong, and you're right that you're not a child anymore. So stop trying to make decisions out of fear. Lucas, you're thoughtful and careful, and I know this terrifies you, but some things are worth being terrified for. And Daniel," she looked at her youngest, who was watching with wide eyes, "you've already lost one home. I won't let you lose another without a fight. We're a family now," Jed added. "Maybe not in the conventional way, maybe not by blood, but we're a family nonetheless, and families stand together. They don't cut and run at the first sign of trouble." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally he nodded. "All right, we fight, but we do it smart. We prepare, we document everything, and we make sure we have every advantage we can get." "Agreed," Jed said. "And we start by finding those survey markers you mentioned," Samuel continued, his mind already working through the logistics. "Before the snow melts completely, while we can still move without anyone knowing. We verify every boundary, photograph or sketch every marker, get ironclad proof of your property lines. That'll mean going into the high country," Jed warned. "It's dangerous in winter, more dangerous than waiting for Harland to make his move." Samuel countered. Jed smiled slightly. "Fair point. All right. Soon as we get a clear weather window, you and I will make the trek." Lucas had been quiet, but now he spoke up. "I should come too. You'll need detailed sketches of the markers, showing their position relative to landmarks. My drawings could be evidence in court. It'll be hard travel," Jed cautioned. "I can handle hard," Lucas said, and there was a new firmness in his voice that reminded Eleanor he was 15 now, nearly a man, and had already endured more hardship than many people faced in a lifetime. The tension that had filled the room began to ease. They had a plan now, however uncertain, and that was better than the vague dread that had been building. But that night, after the boys were asleep, Eleanor found Jed standing outside despite the cold, staring up at stars so bright and numerous they looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and joined him, and he immediately put his arm around her, pulling her close for warmth. "You're worried," she said quietly. "I'm thinking," Jed corrected. "There's a difference. What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking that I told those boys we'd face Harland down with truth and law, and that's what we'll do. But I'm also thinking that men like Harland don't play by the rules when the rules don't suit them. You think he'll come with violence?" Eleanor said, "Not a question. I think he'll try legal means first, because that's easier," Jed replied. "But if that doesn't work, yes, I think he'll escalate. Men don't build empires by accepting defeat gracefully." Eleanor shivered, and not from cold. "I'm putting you in danger. Maybe Samuel's right. Maybe we should—" "Don't," Jed interrupted gently but firmly. "Don't second-guess this, Eleanor. I meant what I said. You and the boys, you're mine now, and I protect what's mine." "I love you," Eleanor said, the words still new enough to make her heart race when she spoke them. "I love you too," Jed replied, and kissed the top of her head. "We're going to get through this. All of us. Together." They stood in the cold and the starlight, holding each other, and Eleanor chose to believe him. Because the alternative, imagining a future without this man, without this home, without the family they were building, was unthinkable. Inside, the fire burned low, and 3 boys slept peacefully, trusting that the adults in their lives would find a way through the challenges ahead. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, keeping their secrets, holding their survey markers, waiting for spring and whatever it would bring. Eleanor touched the gold band on her finger, Thomas's ring that she still wore, that she thought she might always wear. But now she understood it wasn't a barrier between her past and her present. It was a bridge, a reminder that love didn't end, it transformed. Thomas's love had carried her through his death and through the terrible months after. And now Jed's love was carrying her forward into whatever came next. "Come inside," she said softly. "It's too cold out here." "In a minute," Jed replied. I'm memorizing this moment, this feeling. Having you here, knowing the boys are safe inside, knowing we're all together. Because no matter what happens, no one can take this moment away from us." Eleanor understood. She pressed closer against his side, and together they stood under the vast Montana sky, marking this moment of peace before the storm, storing up strength for the battles ahead. Finally, they went inside, banking the fire and checking that the boys were warm beneath their quilts. Jed climbed to his loft, and Eleanor retreated to her room, but before they parted, their hands clasped briefly, a promise without words. Whatever came with the spring, whatever Cyrus Harland had planned, they would face it together. They were a family now, cobbled together from loss and loneliness and the pure grace of two desperate souls, finding each other in the wilderness. And that, Eleanor thought as she drifted towards sleep, was worth fighting for. Worth risking everything for, because some things in life were more precious than safety, more valuable than comfort. Things like home, like family, like love that came when you'd given up hoping, but found the courage to embrace it anyway. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and the mountains kept their watch, and winter held the world in its grip for a while longer. But spring was coming with all its promise and peril. And when it arrived, the found family in the cabin would be ready. February brought a brief window of clear weather, and Jed announced it was time. The survey markers needed to be found and documented before the spring thaw brought both melting snow and Cyrus Harland's men. They prepared for 3 days, gathering supplies and studying Jed's old property maps by firelight. The deed described the boundaries in the careful legal language of territorial surveyors. So many chains north from a marked pine, so many rods west to a stone cairn, following the ridgeline to a granite marker carved with the surveyor's mark. Some of these markers haven't been checked in 20 years, Jed admitted, tracing the property lines with his finger. "My father showed me where they were when I was just a boy, but memory fades. We need to verify they're still there, that they match the deed description exactly. And if they don't," Samuel asked, "then we have a problem," Jed said simply. "But I don't think we will. Stone markers don't move, and the territorial survey was careful work. We just need to prove it." They set out before dawn on a Thursday, Jed and Samuel on horseback, Lucas on the pack mule with his drawing supplies carefully wrapped against the cold. Eleanor stood in the doorway with Daniel beside her, watching them ride into the grey pre-dawn light. "They'll be all right, Ma," Daniel said. But she heard the worry in his young voice. "I know," Eleanor replied, though her heart clenched as they disappeared into the trees. "And come on, let's get breakfast started." The cabin felt too empty with 3 of them gone. Eleanor and Daniel went through their daily routines, but the absence of the others created a hollow space that nothing could quite fill. They ate quiet meals, and Eleanor found herself listening constantly for the sound of returning horses. Meanwhile, high in the mountains, Jed led Samuel and Lucas through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous. The snow was deep here, untouched by anything but wind and wildlife, and their horses struggled through drifts that sometimes reached their chests. "First marker should be just ahead," Jed called back, pointing to a distinctive rock formation. "See that split boulder? The survey stone is supposed to be 50 yards due east." They dismounted and began searching, brushing snow away from likely spots. It was Samuel who found it, a granite stone about 2 feet high, its face carved with the territorial surveyor's symbol and the date, 1855. Below that, carved in neat letters, "Ni corner Boone claim, got it." Samuel shouted, and Lucas immediately began sketching, his fingers red with cold but moving with practiced precision. He drew the marker from multiple angles, noting the split boulder in the background, the distinctive pine trees that form natural landmarks, the way the ridgeline curved away to the south. "This matches the deed exactly," Jed said with satisfaction, reading the carved letters again to be certain. "1 down, 5 to go." The second marker took longer to find. The deed description led them to a high ridge, where wind had scoured away most of the snow, leaving exposed rock and stunted pines bent permanently sideways by decades of relentless wind. They searched for over an hour, beginning to wonder if this marker had been lost to time or weather, when Lucas called out, "Here, it's under this overhang." The stone was smaller than the first, but equally well preserved, tucked into a natural shelter that had protected it from the elements. Lucas sketched while Samuel used a small hand mirror to catch the sunlight and verify the carved details, reading them aloud to compare against the deed. "This is good," Jed said as they prepared to move on. 2 markers verified means the northern boundary is solid. Now we need to check the southern line. They made camp that night in a sheltered valley, building a fire and eating cold venison and hard biscuits while the horses rested. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the silence was profound, the kind of deep mountain quiet that makes a person feel both very small and part of something eternal. "Pa would have loved this," Samuel said suddenly, staring into the fire. "He always talked about seeing more of the high country, but the homestead kept him too busy." "Tell me about him," Jed said. "Your father. What was he like?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. He was steady. "That's the word that comes to mind. Not flashy or dramatic, but reliable. When he said he'd do something, it got done. And he was patient, never raised his voice, even when Lucas and I were being idiots." He smiled slightly at the memory. "He sounds like a good man," Jed said. "He was," Lucas added quietly. "He used to say that the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you gave. That's why he never got rich. He'd give away half our harvest to neighbors who were struggling, or spend days helping someone else fix their barn instead of working our own land." "And your mother?" Jed asked. "What was she like back then?" "Happy," Samuel said simply. "She laughed all the time. She and Pa would dance in the kitchen while she was cooking, and she'd sing even though she can't really carry a tune. After he died," he stopped, his voice catching. "After he died, it was like all the light went out of her. Until we came here. Until you." Jed poked at the fire with a stick, clearly moved but not sure how to respond. "Your father would be proud of you boys," he said finally, "of how you've handled everything, of how you've taken care of your mother and each other. We're learning from you now," Lucas said. "And I think Pa would be glad of that. Would be glad Ma found someone who treats her right, who treats us right." "I'm trying," Jed said quietly. "I never thought I'd have a family again, but here you are, and I'm doing my best not to mess it up." "You're not messing it up," Samuel assured him. "You saved us, Jed, not just from the cold and hunger, but from losing hope, from giving up. That's worth more than I can say." They were quiet after that, each man wrapped in his own thoughts, the fire crackling between them. Above, the stars wheeled slowly through their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggle and connection, but beautiful nonetheless. The next day brought harder travel. They were searching for a marker described as being at the confluence of 2 streams, marked by 3 standing stones arranged in triangle. But winter had frozen the streams and buried everything under snow, making landmarks nearly impossible to identify. They spent hours searching, working in an expanding grid pattern, until finally Samuel's horse nearly stumbled into what turned out to be a snow-covered stream bed. They followed it carefully, found where another stream joined it, and began probing the snow with long sticks. Lucas found the first stone, then the second. The third took longer, but eventually they uncovered all 3, large stones clearly placed by human hands, arranged in a perfect triangle with the survey marker in the center. "This is it," Jed said, brushing snow from the carved surface. "Southwestern corner. That's 3 markers verified, But as Lucas began sketching, Samuel suddenly held up a hand for silence. "Did you hear that?" They all froze, listening. At first, there was nothing but wind, but then it came again. The distant sound of horses, maybe voices carrying on the cold air. "Someone's out here," Samuel said quietly, his hand moving to the rifle on his saddle. "Could be trappers," Jed said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Or could be someone checking the area, seeing what's up here before spring comes." "Harland's men?" Lucas asked, fear evident in his voice. "Maybe." Jed made a decision quickly. "Lucas, finish your sketch fast. Samuel, help me cover our tracks best we can. We don't want to advertise we've been here." They worked quickly and quietly, Lucas's pencil flying across the paper, while Samuel and Jed used pine branches to brush away the worst of their footprints and the disturbed snow around the marker. The sounds of other travelers grew no closer, but they didn't fade either. Whoever it was seemed to be moving parallel to their position, perhaps half a mile away. "Done," Lucas whispered, tucking his sketchbook away. "Let's move," Jed said. "We'll take the long way around to the next marker. Stay off the ridge tops where we might be seen." They traveled carefully for the next several hours, keeping to the trees and low ground, moving as quietly as they could through the snow. The sounds of other travelers eventually faded, but the encounter had reminded them all that they weren't alone in these mountains, and not everyone they might meet would be friendly. The fourth marker was the easiest to find, a distinctive rock formation shaped like a bear's head, with the survey stone placed at what would be the bear's nose. Lucas sketched it quickly, and they moved on without lingering. The fifth marker, however, proved nearly impossible to locate. The deed description placed it at the lightning-struck pine on the eastern ridge, but when they reached the area, they found not one but dozens of dead pines, any of which could have been struck by lightning over the past 70 years. They searched until dusk, growing increasingly frustrated. Finally, Jed called a halt. "We'll camp here tonight, search fresh in the morning with better light. It's here somewhere. We just need to look more carefully." That night, Samuel took first watch, while Jed and Lucas slept. He sat by their small, carefully shielded fire, his rifle across his lap, and thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, his biggest concern had been whether they'd have enough hay for winter. Now here he was, camped in the high mountains, searching for property markers to defend against a corrupt banker, protecting a family that had been remade by loss and luck. He thought about his father, wondered what Thomas would make of all this. Would he approve of Samuel learning to hunt and trap? Would he be glad that Ma had found someone like Jed? Would he understand why Samuel sometimes caught himself thinking of Jed as a second father, even while Thomas's memory remained vivid and cherished? Samuel liked to think the answer was yes to all of it. His father had been practical above all. He'd have wanted his family safe and cared for. And if that meant Eleanor finding love again, if that meant his sons learning from another good man, Thomas would have accepted it, maybe even celebrated it. A sound brought Samuel's attention snapping back to the present. Something was moving in the darkness beyond their camp, something large from the sound of breaking branches. He stood slowly, raising his rifle, his heart hammering. "Jed," he called softly. "Wake up." Jed was alert instantly, years of mountain living making him a light sleeper. He grabbed his sharps and moved to Samuel's side, both of them peering into the darkness. The sound came again, closer now. Then a large shape emerged from the trees, a bull elk, magnificent and unconcerned, moving through their camp area as if they didn't exist. It paused to browse on some exposed grass, its breath steaming in the cold air, then moved on into the night. Samuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Just an elk. Good thing you didn't shoot," Jed said with a slight smile. "We don't need the meat that badly, and the gunshot would have announced our presence for miles." They returned to the fire, and Jed added a few more sticks to bring the flames back to life. "You did good staying alert. Your father taught you well." "I've had 2 good teachers," Samuel replied. Jed looked at him for a long moment. "Samuel, I want you to know I'm not trying to replace your father. I couldn't even if I wanted to. But I'm honored to help finish what he started, to help you become the man he'd have wanted you to be. I know, Samuel said, and I'm grateful for everything. He paused, then added, I'm glad Ma has you. Glad we all do. They clasped hands briefly, a moment of understanding between them. Then Jed sent Samuel to sleep while he took the next watch. Morning brought clearer thinking. Lucas suggested they look not for dead pines, but for the one that might have the most dramatic scarring, the kind of damage a direct lightning strike would cause. They spread out in a careful search pattern, and within an hour, Lucas called out triumphantly. The pine was huge, easily 200 years old, and its trunk bore a long spiral scar where lightning had stripped away bark and wood, leaving a distinctive pattern that spiraled from top to roots. At its base, partially buried but unmistakable, was the survey marker. Last one, Jed said with satisfaction as Lucas sketched furiously. We've got them all. Complete documentation of every boundary marker. This proves beyond any doubt that this land is mine, and the boundaries are exactly as stated in the deed. They began the journey home, moving faster now that their mission was complete, eager to return to Eleanor and Daniel. They made good time, and by late afternoon of the third day, they saw smoke rising from the cabin chimney. Eleanor and Daniel were watching from the porch, and when they spotted the returning travelers, Daniel let out a whoop of joy and came running through the snow. Eleanor followed more slowly, but her face showed her relief and happiness. You found them? She asked as they dismounted. Every single one, Jed confirmed. Lucas has detailed sketches, and we've verified that each marker matches the deed description perfectly. No one can challenge the boundaries now. That evening, they spread Lucas's sketches across the table, comparing them with the deed document. The evidence was undeniable. Every marker was exactly where it should be, and the drawings showed distinctive landmarks that could be verified by any honest surveyor. This is good work, Eleanor said, her hand resting on Jed's shoulder. Really good work. Now we have proof, Jed agreed. When Harland comes, we'll be ready. But Samuel was studying the maps with a thoughtful expression. Jed, when we were up there, those sounds we heard, if it was Harland's men scouting, they might have seen something. Might know we're preparing. Let them know, Jed said firmly. Let Harland understand we're not going to be easy prey. Sometimes the best defense is making sure your enemy knows you're ready for them. Eleanor felt a chill despite the warmth of the cabin. The search had been successful, but it had also started a clock ticking. Harland would come eventually, probably once the passes cleared fully. And when he did, they would face him with truth and law and documented proof, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough, that men like Cyrus Harland didn't rise to power by accepting defeat gracefully. Still, they had months yet before spring would bring the confrontation. Months to prepare, to strengthen their position, to become even more of a family than they already were. She looked around at the faces of her sons and the man she loved. All of them gathered in the warmth and safety of this cabin, and felt gratitude wash over her. Whatever came, they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The hearing was set for the first week of April, giving them precious little time to prepare. Jed rode to Helena himself, a 4-day journey each way, to meet with a territorial attorney named Marcus Webb. He returned exhausted, but cautiously hopeful. Webb will take the case, Jed announced as he dismounted, his face lined with fatigue. He's seen Harland's type before, men who use the law as a weapon against folks who can't fight back. He's interested, especially when I mentioned the forged documents and the suspicious timing of these supposed loans surfacing only after Thomas's death. What does he need from us? Eleanor asked, helping him down from his horse. Everything, Jed replied. Every piece of paper, every document, every witness we can find. He wants Lucas's drawings of the property markers. He wants the deed and all related survey records. He wants a timeline of every interaction you had with Harland, every payment Thomas made, every conversation you can remember. The next 2 weeks became a flurry of preparation. Eleanor wrote out everything she could remember, her hand cramping from hours of careful documentation. Samuel rode to their old homestead, now occupied by one of Harland's associates, and managed to retrieve some of Thomas's personal papers that had been left behind in the rush to vacate. Lucas made copies of all his survey marker sketches, creating duplicates in case the originals were lost or challenged. They also began gathering witnesses. The traveling merchant, Hoskins, agreed to testify about the conversations he'd heard in town, about how Harland had been unusually focused on finding Eleanor. Reverend Morrison from Bitter Creek, who'd known Thomas for years, provided a written statement that Thomas was a man of his word who'd never mentioned any loans outside the mortgage. Most surprisingly, they found an ally in an unexpected place. The clerk who'd worked in Harland's bank, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, appeared at their door one evening. Nervous but determined. "I've been fired," she told them, standing on the porch with her hands twisted together. "Mr. Harland let me go last week, said he was cutting costs. But the truth is, I think he was worried about what I might say." "What might you say?" Jed asked carefully. Sarah looked at Eleanor directly. "That I never saw any loan documents for Thomas Graves beyond the original mortgage. That I handled all the filing, and those papers Mr. Harland is showing now? They never existed until about 2 months ago. I saw him with a forger, a man from Denver who specializes in making old documents look authentic. I heard them discussing it. Would you testify to that?" Eleanor asked, hardly daring to hope. "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "Mr. Harland has hurt too many people. Someone needs to stop him." They had her write out everything she'd witnessed, and Marcus Webb, when he arrived a few days later to review their case, called Sarah's testimony potentially decisive. Webb was a lean man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of quiet competence. He spread all their documents across Jed's table, studying them with the careful attention of someone who understood the stakes. "This is good," he said after hours of review. "Very good. The survey markers prove Boone's property claim is solid. Those markers are official territorial survey work, and they establish boundaries that predate any current dispute. The deed is legitimate, and I've verified with the Territorial Records Office that all proper procedures were followed." "What about Harland's claim that property laws have changed?" Jed asked. "Intimidation tactic," Webb replied dismissively. "Old territorial claims are grandfathered under current law precisely to prevent this kind of challenge. He knows that, or his lawyers do. He's hoping you don't. And my supposed debts?" Eleanor asked. "Much weaker case than he wants you to believe," Webb said. "These loan documents are obviously fabricated, the paper's too new, the ink's too fresh, and the signatures don't match other examples of Thomas Graves's handwriting that we have. Add in Miss Mitchell's testimony about the forger, and we can prove fraud conclusively. So we'll win." Samuel asked. Webb hesitated. "In a fair court, absolutely. But there's the problem. The local judge in Bitter Creek is known to favor Harland's interests. We'll need to argue for a change of venue, get the case moved to Helena, where we have a better chance of impartial judgment. That will take time and legal maneuvering." "How much time?" Eleanor asked. "Weeks, possibly months," Webb admitted. "Harland will fight the venue change, argue that local jurisdiction applies. It could drag on." "We don't have months," Jed said quietly. "Spring is here. The homestead needs work. And every day this hangs over us is a day we can't move forward with our lives." Webb studied him thoughtfully. "There might be another way. If we can prove Harland's documents are forgeries quickly enough, convincingly enough, we might force him to withdraw his claims before any hearing. Public exposure of fraud would ruin his reputation and possibly lead to criminal charges against him." "How would we do that?" Lucas asked. "We'd need to get a handwriting expert to examine both the forged loans and authentic samples of Thomas Graves's signature," Webb explained. "If the expert's testimony is strong enough, and if we can present it publicly, say at the preliminary hearing in Bitter Creek, we might shame Harland into backing down." "Shame?" Samuel scoffed. "Men like Harland don't feel shame." "No," Webb agreed, "but they do feel fear. Fear of losing their power, their reputation, their ability to manipulate the law. If we can expose him publicly, other people he's victimized might come forward. His whole empire could start to crumble. Then that's what we do, Eleanor said firmly. We go to that hearing. We present our evidence, and we expose him for the fraud he is. The night before they were to leave for Bitter Creek, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay beside Jed, still chastely, though they'd been engaged for weeks now, and listened to him breathe. The circuit judge had come and gone 2 weeks earlier, and they were married now, legally and properly. She was Eleanor Boone, and the name felt both strange and right, but being married wouldn't matter if they lost everything tomorrow. "You're thinking too loud," Jed murmured, reaching for her hand in the darkness. "I'm scared," Eleanor admitted. "What if Webb is wrong? What if the judge sides with Harland anyway? What if—" "Then we appeal," Jed interrupted gently. "And if that doesn't work, we find another way. Eleanor, I told you before, I won't let him destroy us. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. You, me, the boys, Webb, we're not alone in this. I keep thinking about that first night," Eleanor said. "When we arrived here, half frozen and desperate, and you said, 'You're home now,' it felt like a miracle then. It still does." "It wasn't a miracle," Jed replied. "It was just right. You were supposed to be here. I was supposed to find you. Everything else is just details we need to work through." Eleanor rolled over to face him, even though she could barely see his features in the darkness. "I love you, Jedediah Boone. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that. You saved us, not just from the cold, but from giving up. You gave us hope again." "You saved me too," Jed said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was just existing before you came. Now I'm living. That's worth fighting for." They held each other until sleep finally came, fitful and light, and when dawn broke grey and cold, they rose to face what was coming. The 5 of them rode toward Bitter Creek together, Jed and Eleanor in front, Samuel and Lucas flanking, Daniel riding between them on his small horse. Marcus Webb met them at the edge of town, along with Sarah Mitchell, who looked terrified but determined. "Remember," Webb told them as they prepared to enter the courthouse, "stay calm, stay dignified, and let me do the talking, unless I specifically ask you to respond. Harland will try to provoke you, to make you look unstable or violent. Don't give him that satisfaction." The courthouse was packed. Apparently word had spread that there would be a confrontation between Cyrus Harland and the widow he'd dispossessed, and half the town had turned out to watch. Eleanor recognized many faces, neighbors from her old life, townspeople who'd expressed sympathy but offered no help, merchants who'd extended credit to Thomas but closed their doors to her after his death. Harland sat at the front with 2 expensive lawyers, looking confident and prosperous. When Eleanor entered with Jed at her side and her sons behind her, Harland's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or annoyance. The judge, a hard-faced man named Cyrus Brennan, who was rumored to have financial ties to Harland's bank, called the hearing to order. "We're here regarding the matter of outstanding debts owed by Eleanor Graves, now Eleanor Boone, to the First Bank of Bitter Creek," Judge Brennan intoned. "Mr. Harland, present your case." Harland's lead lawyer stood and began presenting the supposed loan documents, explaining in careful legal language how Thomas Graves had borrowed substantial sums over several years, how these debts had gone unpaid, how the bank was simply seeking what was legally owed. It all sounded very official, very legitimate. Eleanor felt her stomach clench as she listened to her late husband being portrayed as a man who borrowed recklessly and left his widow with impossible debts. Then it was Webb's turn. "Your Honor," he began, "what we have here is not a case of unpaid debts, but a case of systematic fraud. These documents Mr. Harland's lawyers have presented are forgeries, created recently to give legal cover to what is essentially extortion." Harland's lawyers immediately objected, but Webb continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "I have here authenticated samples of Thomas Graves's handwriting from various legitimate documents. His marriage certificate, his original mortgage papers, letters written to friends and family. I also have an expert analysis from a territorial examiner who has compared these authentic samples to the signatures on the supposed loan documents." He presented a thick folder to the judge. The conclusion is definitive. The signatures on the loan documents are forgeries. Furthermore, I have testimony from a witness who will state under oath that she saw Mr. Harland meeting with a known forger from Denver, discussing the creation of these very documents. The courtroom erupted. Judge Brennan banged his gavel for order, and Harland's face had gone red with fury. "This is outrageous," one of Harland's lawyers sputtered. "These accusations of forgery are supported by expert testimony and eyewitness accounts," Webb interrupted smoothly. "I'd also like to present testimony from several other citizens of Bitter Creek who have similar stories. Sudden discoveries of old debts they never owed, documents appearing that they'd never signed. Pressure from Mr. Harland to give up property or pay money they didn't legitimately owe," he gestured. And 3 people stood up in the gallery, a farmer, a widow, a young couple. Eleanor didn't know them, but their faces told stories of struggle and fear. "Objection!" Harland's lawyer shouted. "This hearing is about Mrs. Boone's debts, not baseless accusations against my client." "The accusations establish a pattern," Webb countered. "A pattern of fraudulent documents being used to extort money and property from vulnerable citizens. Mrs. Boone's case is not isolated. It's part of a larger scheme of corruption." Judge Brennan looked uncomfortable now, clearly caught between his loyalty to Harland and the public nature of these accusations. The courtroom was full of witnesses, and many were nodding at Webb's words. "Murmuring agreement, Your Honor," Webb pressed. "I move that these supposed debts be dismissed as fraudulent, and furthermore, I move that a territorial investigation be opened into Mr. Harland's banking practices, specifically regarding the authenticity of loan documents in other cases." The judge hesitated, clearly calculating the political costs of different decisions. Finally, he spoke. "I'm prepared to dismiss the debt claims pending independent verification of the document's authenticity. However, I'm not prepared to order an investigation based solely on accusations made in this hearing. If the territorial authorities wish to pursue that matter, it's outside this court's jurisdiction. It wasn't everything they wanted, but it was enough." The debts were dismissed. Eleanor felt relief flood through her so strongly that her knees went weak. Jed's hand found hers and squeezed, but Harland wasn't finished. He stood, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying through the courtroom. "You think you've won, Boone? You and your widow and her bastard sons? I'll bury you. I'll find another way. This land, this territory, it belongs to men of vision and capital, not hermits squatting in the wilderness." "Is that a threat, Mr. Harland?" Judge Brennan asked sharply, clearly aware that he needed to establish some authority. "It's a promise," Harland replied. "A promise that people who interfere with legitimate business interests will learn the cost of that interference." "Mr. Harland, I'm warning you," the judge began, but Harland was already striding out of the courtroom, his lawyers scrambling to follow. The hearing dissolved into chaos, people talking excitedly, some approaching Eleanor to express support, others hurrying after Harland to see what he'd do next. Webb was immediately surrounded by the other people who claimed Harland had defrauded them, all of them eager to tell their stories now that someone had stood up to the banker. Eleanor barely heard any of it. She turned to Jed, and he pulled her into his arms right there in the courthouse. "Propriety be damned. It's over," he murmured into her hair. "The debts are gone. You're free. We're free," Eleanor corrected, holding him tight. Samuel, Lucas, and Daniel surrounded them, all of them joining in an embrace that drew smiles from the remaining townspeople. This was a family. Anyone could see that. Not perfect, not conventional, but real and strong and united. Marcus Webb extracted himself from the crowd and came over, a satisfied smile on his face. "That went better than I'd hoped. The dismissal's formal and final. Harland can't pursue those debts again. And I suspect the Territorial Attorney General will take an interest in those other cases now that they've been aired publicly." "Thank you," Eleanor said, emotion making her voice thick. "For everything." "My pleasure," Webb replied. "It's rare I get to take down a bully so thoroughly in one hearing. This is a good day for justice." They stayed in town only long enough to file the necessary papers and make arrangements for Webb to continue monitoring the situation. Then they rode home to their cabin in the mountains, feeling lighter than they had in months. As they crested the last ridge and saw smoke rising from their chimney, Samuel had ridden ahead to restart the fire. Eleanor looked at the home they'd built together. This haven carved from wilderness and loss, and felt peace settle in her bones. They'd faced the threat. They'd stood together, and they'd won. But even in victory, Eleanor couldn't completely shake the memory of Harland's face, twisted with rage and humiliation. Webb had called it a good day for justice, and he was right. But she also knew that men like Harland didn't accept defeat gracefully. Still, that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, they would celebrate. They would gather around their table, this found family, and they would give thanks for the home and safety and love they'd discovered in the least likely of circumstances. "You're home now," Jed had said that first night. And it was true. They were home, all of them, together, and that was worth any fight. 2 days after their return from Bitter Creek, Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke that was wrong somehow. Not the familiar scent of the morning fire, but something sharper, more acrid. She sat up in bed, her heart already racing before her mind understood why. "Jed," she said, shaking him awake, "something's burning." He was on his feet instantly, years of mountain living making him alert to danger. They rushed to the window and saw it, orange flames climbing into the pre-dawn darkness, and they were coming from the barn. "Boys," Jed shouted, already pulling on his boots, "fire, get up." They all moved with practiced efficiency, everyone knowing their role from the drills Jed had made them practice. Samuel and Lucas grabbed buckets and ran for the creek. Daniel began pumping water from the well, and Eleanor and Jed raced toward the barn, where their horses were trapped inside, screaming their fear into the night. Jed kicked open the barn door, and smoke billowed out thick enough to make them choke. He tied a wet cloth over his face and plunged inside, while Eleanor stayed at the entrance, ready to help lead the panicked animals out. "Easy, easy," she heard. Jed's voice through the roar of flames, calm and steady even now. "Come on, girl, that's it!" The first horse burst through the smoke, eyes rolling white with terror, and Eleanor caught its halter and pulled it clear, then ran back for the next. Jed emerged, leading 2 more, their coats singed but alive, and Samuel ran up to take their leads and get them far from the fire. "That's all of them," Jed gasped, coughing hard from the smoke. "The mule! I couldn't find the mule." "There," Lucas pointed. Through the barn's back window, they could see the mule had kicked through its stall and escaped into the pasture on its own, standing at a safe distance and braying its distress. They formed a bucket brigade, passing water from creek to fire, trying desperately to save what they could. But the barn was old wood, dry despite the spring moisture, and it burned fast. Within 20 minutes, they had to accept that the structure was lost and focus on making sure the flames didn't spread to the cabin. By the time the sun rose, the barn was a smoking ruin, and they were all black with soot and exhausted from fighting the fire. But the cabin stood untouched, the animals were safe, and no one was hurt. "How did it start?" Samuel asked, staring at the destruction. "We banked the lanterns last night. There was no reason for a fire." Jed was walking the perimeter of the burned structure, his expression grim. He stopped suddenly, knelt, and picked something up from the ground. When he returned, he held out his hand to show them, a piece of cloth that smelled of kerosene and the remains of a torch. "It was set deliberately," he said quietly. "Someone came here in the night and burned our barn." Eleanor felt cold settle over her, despite the residual heat from the fire. "Harland has to be," Samuel agreed, his fists clenched. "He couldn't beat us in court, so now he's trying to drive us out through violence." "We don't know it was him directly," Lucas said, ever the voice of careful reason. "Could have been men he hired. Could have been someone else entirely who has a grudge against Jed." "Don't matter who struck the match," Jed replied, his voice hard. "What matters is what we do about it." "We report it," Eleanor said firmly. "We go to the territorial marshal. We show him the evidence. and we make sure this gets investigated properly. And while we're doing that, they might come back, Samuel pointed out. Burn the cabin next time, or worse. Daniel had been quiet through all of this, but now he spoke up, his voice small but determined. We can't leave. This is our home. No one's leaving, Jed assured him, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder. But we need to be smarter, more prepared. This was a warning. They wanted to scare us, show us they could reach us even up here. Next time they might come with more than torches. They spent that day improving their defenses. Jed and Samuel cleared sightlines around the cabin, removing brush and low branches that could provide cover for anyone approaching. Lucas was tasked with creating a watch schedule and setting up an alarm system, strings attached to bells at different approaches to the property. Eleanor prepared emergency supplies, bags they could grab quickly if they needed to evacuate, water and food stashed in multiple locations. Daniel was given the most important job of all, memorizing the route to the nearest ranch, 5 miles east over the ridge. If things went bad, if they got separated, Daniel was to run to the Hutchinson place and bring help. You're our insurance, Jed told him seriously. If you have to run, you run fast, and you don't look back. You understand? I understand, Daniel said, standing a little straighter under the weight of this responsibility. That evening, as Eleanor was preparing a subdued dinner from their diminished supplies, they'd lost feed and stores in the barn fire. She heard horses approaching. Everyone grabbed weapons, taking positions, until Jed called out, "It's all right, I know them." 3 men rode into the clearing, ranchers from the valley below, including Marcus Hutchinson, on whose property Daniel had been trained to seek refuge. They dismounted slowly, hands visible, clearly meaning no threat. "Jed," Hutchinson said, nodding a greeting. "We saw the smoke yesterday, figured you might have had trouble. Came to check on you." "Barn's gone," Jed replied. "Set deliberately. We're all right, but someone's trying to drive us off." Hutchinson and his companions exchanged glances. "We heard about the hearing in Bitter Creek," Hutchinson said, "about how you stood up to Harland. Word travels fast, and folks are talking. Some are saying you did what needed doing, others—" He paused. "Others are saying you made a powerful enemy." "Harland did this?" one of the other ranchers asked. "A man named Peterson." "Can't prove it," Jed admitted, "but the timing's suspicious." "We wanted you to know," Hutchinson continued, "that there are folks in this territory who respect what you did, who are tired of Harland using his money and position to push people around. If you need help, if he comes at you again, you've got friends who'll stand with you." Eleanor felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to let fall. After months of feeling isolated, of believing they stood alone against Harland's power, having neighbors offer support felt like a lifeline. "We appreciate that," Jed said, shaking Hutchinson's hand firmly. "More than you know." "There's more," Hutchinson added. "We've been organizing, quietly so Harland doesn't hear about it. Talking to other folks he's squeezed over the years, other people who've lost property or been forced into bad deals. We're thinking about presenting a formal complaint to the territorial governor, asking for a real investigation into his practices." "Marcus Webb mentioned something similar," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "He said if enough people came forward, Harland's whole operation could be exposed." "That's what we're hoping," Peterson agreed. "But we need someone willing to lead it, someone who's already stood up to him publicly, someone like you folks." Jed and Eleanor exchanged glances. This was more than they'd bargained for, not just defending themselves, but becoming the face of a larger movement against corruption. "We'll think about it," Jed said carefully. "Right now, our priority is keeping our family safe, but we'll consider what you're asking." The ranchers nodded, understanding. Before they left, they helped carry water to refill the cabin's reserves and brought news from town. Harland had been unusually quiet since the hearing, staying in his offices, seeing very few people. Some thought he was planning his next move. Others hoped he'd been chastened enough to back down. Eleanor didn't believe the latter for a second. That night, they instituted their new watch schedule. Samuel took first shift, positioned where he could see the main approaches to the property. Eleanor couldn't sleep, knowing her son was out there in the dark, watching for threats. She got up and made him hot coffee, bringing it out to his position. "You should rest, Ma," Samuel said, accepting the cup gratefully. "So should you," Eleanor replied, sitting beside him on the fallen log he'd chosen as his watchpost. They were quiet for a while, listening to the night sounds, owls hunting, a distant coyote, the wind through the pines. Finally, Samuel spoke. "I killed a man once. Did I ever tell you that?" Eleanor's heart seized. "What? When?" "Not really killed," Samuel clarified quickly, "but almost. Remember that trapper who came through our old place about 2 years ago? The one who got drunk and tried to force his way into the house?" Eleanor remembered. Thomas had been away getting supplies, and she'd been alone with the boys. "The trapper had been aggressive, violent, clearly dangerous. I hit him with the fire poker," Samuel continued. "Hit him hard enough that he went down and didn't move for a while. I thought I'd killed him. Pa came home and ran him off, told me I'd done the right thing protecting you and my brothers. But I still see his face sometimes, the way he looked when he went down." "Samuel, that was defense," Eleanor said firmly. "That was protecting your family." "I know," Samuel replied. "But now, sitting here with a rifle, knowing that if someone comes to hurt us, I'll have to shoot them, it's different when you're waiting for it. When you know it might happen." Eleanor took his hand, this son who was trying so hard to be a man, to be strong enough to protect everyone. "Your father would be proud of you, not because you can shoot, but because you understand that violence is serious, that taking a life, even in defense, is not something to treat lightly." Would he be proud of all this? Samuel asked, gesturing vaguely at their situation. "Of you marrying Jed? Of us becoming this, whatever we are now?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "He would. Because we survived, Samuel. We didn't just survive, we found a way to live again, to hope again. Your father would want that for all of us." Samuel nodded slowly. "I like Jed," he said quietly. "I respect him. He's a good man, and he's been good to us. But sometimes I feel like I'm betraying Pa by accepting him so easily." "You're not betraying anyone," Eleanor assured him. "You're honoring your father by learning from another good man, by protecting your family, by choosing life instead of just existing in grief. That's exactly what your father would have wanted." They sat together in the darkness until it was time for Lucas to take the next watch. And Eleanor felt the bond between herself and her oldest son strengthen, even as she worried about the weight he was carrying on his young shoulders. The days following the barn fire were tense. They rebuilt what they could, creating a temporary shelter for the horses using salvaged wood and canvas. Jed taught the boys more advanced defensive tactics, and they practiced scenarios, what to do if attackers came from multiple directions, how to fall back to stronger positions, when to fight and when to run. It felt like preparing for war, and in a way, that's exactly what it was. A week after the fire, Marcus Webb arrived with news. He'd been in contact with the Territorial Attorney General, and there was indeed interest in investigating Harland's banking practices. Several other victims had come forward, and the case was building. But these things took time, months, possibly a year or more, before any formal charges might be filed. In the meantime, Webb warned, Harland is likely to become more desperate. Cornered animals lash out, and he knows his empire is starting to crumble. "You need to be very careful. We are being careful," Jed assured him. "But we can't live like this forever, looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next attack." "I know," Webb said sympathetically, "which is why I want to propose something. There's going to be a territorial assembly meeting in Helena next month. It's where all the important political and business figures gather. If you could attend, if Eleanor could tell her story publicly to that audience, it would put enormous pressure on Harland. He couldn't afford to be seen as a villain by the very people whose goodwill his business depends on." "You want us to go public," Eleanor said. "Really public. I want you to make it impossible for him to hide," Webb confirmed. "Make him the story. Make his corruption the scandal everyone's talking about. Sometimes the best defense is a very public offense." Eleanor looked at Jed, saw her own uncertainty reflected in his face. Going to Helena, speaking publicly, meant putting themselves even more in Harland's crosshairs. But it also meant taking control of the narrative, fighting back instead of just defending. "We'll do it," Eleanor said before she could second-guess herself. "We'll go to Helena. We'll tell our story. And we'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man Cyrus Harland is." Jed reached for her hand, squeezed it gently. "Together," he said. "Together." Eleanor agreed. That night, as they prepared for bed, Eleanor stood at the window looking out at the mountains that had become home. Somewhere out there, Cyrus Harland was planning his next move. Somewhere out there, danger waited. But here, in this cabin, with this man beside her and her son safe under this roof, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just hope, but determination. They'd survived loss and displacement. They'd survived winter and threats. They'd faced down corruption in a courtroom and fire in the night. They would survive this too. And more than survive, they would win. Because that's what families did. They protected each other. They stood together. They fought for what mattered. "What are you thinking?" Jed asked, coming to stand beside her. "I'm thinking that Thomas's pocket watch stopped at 2:47, Eleanor said. "Stopped at the moment he died. But time didn't stop for the rest of us. We kept moving forward, kept living. And now we're here, and I'm grateful for every moment, even the hard ones, that brought us to this place." She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "I'm thinking that tomorrow we start preparing for Helena. We gather every piece of evidence. We practice what we'll say, and we get ready to fight the biggest fight of our lives. Not with guns or violence, but with truth and courage, and the simple fact that we refuse to let a corrupt man destroy what we've built." Jed pulled her close, and she felt his steady heartbeat against her cheek. "We'll win," he said quietly. "We have to, because there's no other acceptable outcome." Outside, Samuel was at his watchpost, alert and ready. Lucas was sleeping with one hand on his rifle. Daniel was curled up with dreams that were probably more peaceful than reality deserved. And inside, two people who'd found each other in the wilderness stood together, preparing for the battle ahead. The mountains stood eternal around them, keeping their secrets, bearing witness to this family's story. And in the darkness, somewhere far below, Cyrus Harland made his plans, unaware that the widow and her mountain man were about to become his worst nightmare. Not through violence or intimidation, but through something far more powerful, the truth, told by people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The final confrontation was coming. But this time, they would face it not as victims, but as warriors. Not as people running from their past, but as a family fighting for their future. And that made all the difference.